when we were organizing this conference, we searched for someone from the peacebuilding field, which is my field also, who could bring us new insights in bridging peacebuilding with trauma sensitivity. We also felt that it was critical to invite someone who could speak to us not only from his or her background in doing international work, but also work right here at home in the US. Our speaker tonight stood out, and I think you will agree that we are both lucky and honored to have him here with us for this conference. In today's current climate, when racial tensions on college campuses are receiving national and local attention, and when our own DU community is being directly impacted by these national conversations, it is imperative that we as practitioners and students and faculty and staff learn and engage in work around trauma, conflict resolution, and peacebuilding. As such, I'm honored to introduce our speaker this evening. Dr. David Anderson Hooker joins us this evening from the University of Notre Dame's Keough School of Public Affairs. He is professor in the practice of conflict transformation and peacebuilding program at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. He has his BS from Morehouse College, his MPH and MPA from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, his JD from Emory University's School of Law, his MDiv from Emory's Candler School of Theology, and his PhD from Tilburg University in the Netherlands. Professor Hooker is an experienced facilitator, mediator, and peace builder, working with communities, non-governmental organizations, governments, and civil society organizations on public policy and civil and social justice issues, including post-conflict community building and environmental justice. Dr. Hooker has managed multi-party conflicts and has taught numerous workshops and graduate-level courses in negotiation, mediation, conflict resolution, conflict analysis, trauma healing, and conflict transformation. Formerly, Dr. Hooker served as Georgia's Assistant Attorney General and as a Senior Fellow for Community Engagement Strategies at the University of Georgia's J.W. Fanning Institute for Leadership Development. He also, I learned tonight, worked for the National Institute for Dispute Resolution, which was an organization near and dear to my heart as well in the earlier years when we were trying to more broadly and nationally disseminate dispute resolution awareness and techniques. He currently consults worldwide as the president and principal consultant of Counter Stories Consulting, where he focuses on narrative alignment for civic, community, and faith leaders. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to our guest, Dr. David Anderson Hooker.
So part of the concern is this, which is that, so you all don't understand the problematic associated with handing me a mic, right? Among the many things I am, which wasn't in my introduction, I am trained in the Black church tradition. I am actually ordained in the Black church tradition, and so with a mic, with a lectern, with a congregation, things could change. Like, you know, I could be talking about this and all of a sudden I could feel my help coming and we could be in a very different space. So this could be problematic. I'm gonna try and stick inside of, I actually am going to try and focus as a lecturer for the evening, hoping that I'm contained in that way. I'll try, but you know, some points I imagine it'll shift anyway. Look, so one of the things that happened is I had a presentation before I left Indiana. And I got here and I started listening to some of the presentations. I was like, oh, that's really important. And I would either hold back a question, or I would have a question, or I would hear something. There were some brilliant insights and things. As I went home, and the first night I went home after Bob's talk, and after the pre-conference, and I reorganized some things. And after the second day, I reorganized some things. And I left here at lunch and went home and reorganized. And so we're all hearing this talk brand new for the very first time, all right? Trauma, trust, which is really interesting. I haven't heard a whole lot of conversation about trust during our time together, but trauma, trust, and peace building is what, in theory, we're talking about tonight. And I want to approach that subject by offering a particular framing. It's something that I'm testing out. It's still very new. I would say that I covet your responses and honest feedback on how this framing may or may not land with you or resonate both tonight and then later on. To the extent that you're willing to share with me, I would love to have it. Radical identity formation, peace building for ruptured social systems. In his Atlantic monthly article entitled "The Case for Reparations," Ta-Nehisi Coates recounts that, just as a technicality, when I do this, I'm actually quoting so that I don't have to say quote, end quote. I try to do this as my quote signal, all right? When Harvard sociologist Robert Sampson examined incarceration rates in Chicago in his book, The Great American City, he found that a black neighborhood with one of the highest incarceration rates had more than 40 times as high as the white neighborhood with the highest rate. This is a staggering differential, even for community-level comparisons, Sampson writes. A difference of kind, not of degree. In other words, Chicago's impoverished black neighborhoods, characterized by high unemployment, households headed by single parents, are not simply poor, they are ecologically distinct. What Coates is pointing to by reference is the ecological distinction, is an understanding that it is also articulated by Urie Bronfenbrenner in his ecological model of human development. Bronfenbrenner describes development of human identity as occurring primarily, if not exclusively, in relationship to other beings, systems, and structures. So while we often look at the individual as the unit of analysis for our work in mental health and psychosocial trauma healing, and I think the efficacy of the work suffers because we do, Bronfenbrenner would push us to forefront systemic relational aspects of our work and to conduct individualized work only as a tactic from inside of an otherwise wholly systemic framework. To push this even further, I think that even a systemic analysis limits the scope of our understanding of the ways and the way we make our work availing. Michel Foucault would cause us to consider that all systems only exist as structural manifestations of the narrative or discourse that frame our lives. So while both narrative or discourse are susceptible to transformation, they're still much more durable than systems. To better understand the societal rupture that we're working with, I think it's also good to follow classic peace-building models and understand. So first we're operating in an ecologically distinct model that is framed by narratives and discourse. But let's take a step back, look at a couple of the classic peace-building frameworks that help us to think more about the rupture. And I want to talk a bit about the rupture and then present the framework that I'm offering inside of it, because the framework is only valuable if the analysis of the rupture is right. Yeah? So John Paul Lederach offers us this distinction. People who are familiar with his work know his distinction between episode and epicenter. And that's often a helpful distinction, but we could use more. And so Johann Galtung also offers an explication of violence, where he makes the distinction between direct violence, structural violence, and cultural violence. You all know this, but let me just make sure. So direct violence being not just physical direct interaction, but anything ultimately, it could be verbal insults, it could be any other way, microaggressions, anything that impedes the capacity for full group and individual expression, and is to some extent directed either at the individual or the group. That's direct violence. Structural violence is when that violence gets embedded into our systems and it no longer needs agency. So sometimes we talk about racism and we describe racism and sexism and heterosexism and Islamophobia as the things that people do. And we actually have racism and sexism and Islamophobia so deeply embedded in our systems that we no longer need racists or sexists or heterosexists in order to maintain the systems. That's structural violence. John Paul still talks about kind of, after episodes, he talks about issues, pattern, and also history. And Galtung talks about this direct, structural, and even cultural violence. And they both use this metaphor of the earthquake, and so it's helpful. Direct violence would be the earthquake. Structural violence is the shifting of the tectonic plates, the thing that gets manifest in many ways by the earthquake. And Galtung talks about the source, the cultural violence, that permanent place, as the fault line. And so there are a lot of times where we actually can adopt that metaphor, but I think that the use of the metaphor, while it shows us some things, every metaphor has the same character. It shows us things, it hides some things. And one of the things that gets hidden by this metaphor, when we look at the structural ruptures that are happening in society, or the ruptures that are happening in society, one of the things that gets hidden is the fact that most of the ruptures occur along socially constructed lines. We like to believe that those fault lines, if you use the earthquake metaphor, the fault line seems to be a tangible, structural thing. But the places where our ruptures happen, ethnicity, race, gender, engendered sexuality, religious kind of manifestations, and these kinds of things, all of those are socially constructed, right? Race is fiction. Religion operates along the trajectory of mythologies. What we suggest that we know about engendered existence and sexuality is mostly socially constructed from patriarchal and theological pseudoscientific constructions that operate within the same level of veracity as Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, and Bigfoot. Like almost every other aspect of our lives, they are narratives, they're just stories. The problematic is that we have organized them as though we've organized our lives around them as though they are true. And so what makes a narrative true is that we will organize our lives around it. And so for us, for now, race is truth. Religion is truth. Gender, sexuality are all truth only because we've organized our lives around them, not because they're anything other than fiction. Do you remember the year that you no longer needed Santa Claus in order to appreciate the nature of that holiday season, right? What we're trying to build is a life where we're living the year after Santa Claus. Like, how do we get past the fictions that have organized our lives? So even those categories, though, race, ethnicity, all that kind of stuff, they have this kind of pseudoscientific categorizational underpinning, and we'd like to believe that they have some science base. Most of them do not. But all of them, if we go back even to most of the science foundation, most science is actually faith as well, right? Science is faith, and it operates from a foundation. Mathematics is one of the pure original sciences, and it operates from a foundational binary assertion, which is this. If you do set theory, if you do quantum, if you do most of the mathematics, there's this one assertion, mathematical assertion that is proposed, and all the proofs, 1 plus 1 only equals 2 if this is true. If the thing can never equal not the thing. If T does not equal not T, that has to be true in order for all mathematics to follow. We operate on the assumption that T can never equal not T. That binary assumption creates the space for other. It's the foundational principle from which othering emerges. Our work has to be to rid ourselves of some of the foundational philosophical assertions that were presented as though they were the truth. So, in many ways, if we can reject this assertion, we are well on our way to addressing the peace-building project that we're up to. It's not just, though, that it's foundational in this way. It's cellular. Thank you. I went back. I had to include this to make sure we got it. It's all the way. It's cellular. It's embodied. It's absolutely. It's at the deep, the kind of that ontological level, and at the deep micro level is the work we have to do. Thank you for that. I went back to rewrite to make sure that I got that in. You can't see this, can you? So, oh, and it doesn't show up. Translating from Mac to not Mac is often a challenge. But anyway, what I'm trying to show here is kind of, and many of us, if you look at it, even without knowing everything that's there, you recognize that this is Mari Dugan's nested theory, that conflict, trauma, all of those things are embedded so that there's issue, sits in relationships, subsystems, systems. And it's also embedded in time. So what's happening now may have some origin from now, but it also has some early notions from, so what's happening in this decade probably has some foreshadowing from, the centuries before, and even from the era and the age before that. And what John Paul has done with this nested theory is also to suggest that the work that we do looks at different time scales. And so if you're trying to do work now, you're dealing with crisis, you're in the 0 to 12 month. If you're trying to do different levels of work, our levels of societal change depend on the time frame that we're operating in. I like and we're still in this nested theory, but I like what Jerem Sawatsky has done with this time piece. Jerem actually expanded our understanding of the time that we ought to work in. I think to a great extent, our peace-building project is pathologically future-oriented. We haven't spent enough time managing and drawing from both the challenge and the assets of the past. And so Jerem offers us this notion of ephemeral history as kind of that fast-moving, incidental, episodic time that we currently live in and describe as present. A conjectural history, which is where meaning was often altered because of traumagenic circumstances and conditions and shifting norms and kind of shifting world order. And then there's that deep ancestral, structural history where values emerge, where the deep teachings emerge. And so in our work, if we think about the levels that we're operating in, and we can really consider the time frame, there is additional work that we can do. And trauma is healed in the reconstruction of meaning, and not necessarily just in the space where we're taking responsibility. So, what helps me, this is a lot, and it's a lot at dinner, and this is on Friday night. What kind of lives are you all living that this is what you would do on a Friday night? Okay. So all of this, let me share with you just a really quick snippet on my understanding of how I understand trauma, particularly multi-generational trauma, how trauma gets passed down, because that gets built into everything else that I do. Peter Levine, the idea that a traumagenic circumstance, trauma is never the event. Let's step past that. Trauma is not an event. People didn't experience the trauma. An event happens which overwhelms people's capacity to respond, their capabilities to respond at the individual and group level. Their individual and group inability to respond produces the overwhelm, and the response to the overwhelm is the trauma. We perform trauma. We don't have trauma. We perform trauma. We experience, and so the only way that you know that trauma is happening is because we've got these symptomatologies, we've got these manifestations. The trauma is directed in the overwhelm. We look at trauma and we suggest things like hypervigilance and so forth, and paranoia is trauma, and we don't ever think about necessarily trauma as also like what you watched Martin King do on a regular basis was perform trauma. He was working with a community that was overwhelmed by their capacity to respond, but it was the spiritual growth and expression that came out of that that was actually their performative response to an overwhelming circumstance. So trauma is the response to the overwhelming circumstance, right? And how does that get passed down? How does that get perpetuated over time? It's important that it's performative. Trauma occurs, this is slightly different phrasing on it. Trauma occurs when there is an experience of threat, overwhelm, or what Judith Butler would describe as precarity. Butler says, precarity reflects the state of existence in which anything living can be expunged at will or by accident, and its persistence is in no sense guaranteed. She goes on to say, precarity designates, and for some of you, you will recognize this space, precarity designates that politically induced condition in which certain populations suffer from failing social economic networks of support and become differentially exposed to injury, violence, and death. Such populations are at heightened risk of disease, poverty, starvation, displacement, and of exposure to violence without protection. Precarity also characterizes that politically induced condition of maximized vulnerability and exposure for populations exposed to arbitrary state violence and to other forms of aggression that are not enacted by states, but against which states are unwilling to offer adequate protection. The overwhelming sense that your life is going to be extinguished, irreparably harmed, changed, altered in some way. The narrative that informs your life as being orderly and safety, when that's deeply disrupted, it can become a traumagenic circumstance. And then two things happen over multiple generations. When trauma happens, people perform in response to it. In order to get a sense of organization back in your life, you develop stories. People have stories, history, folklore, mythology, lies that they tell about it, and then they build systems. We talk about this as legacy, which is the stuff that you you inherit. Mythology, folklore, lies, history, they all are in that same category. And aftermath, the structural stuff. If you think about aftermath after a storm, it's the rubble, right? Go look at 9/11 at the 9/11 Memorial Center, right? There's this memorial there, and there was a lot of rubble that couldn't be removed. There was a lot of iron and steel and things that couldn't be removed. There was glass, and so they crushed it, and they built it into the artwork. And so the results of the trauma are built into the artwork. Let me give you another example of how rubble and aftermath exists in our life. At the time of emancipation in 1865, fully 70% of all economic industry in the southern and confederated states were built on a model of uncompensated labor. In order to maintain that without crushing or losing the capacity for the South to survive, there needed to be another mechanism for the adoption or the acquisition of uncompensated labor. We passed the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment has within it the most virulent comma in the constitutional aura. The original organization of the 13th Amendment, the original proposition was, all badges and incidents of slavery shall be abolished, period, full stop. What it actually turned out to be was all badges and incidents of slavery shall be abolished, comma, except when someone has been imprisoned because of a crime. And so then we could use that criminal opening to create the convict leasing system to provide, and so we could provide labor to all of those people who needed uncompensated labor. Look, if you travel around the South, one of the things, I'm on a digression right now, I've lost my time, but don't worry about that. If you're traveling around the South, look in some places like Birmingham and Montgomery and Mississippi and some other places where they had big coal, steel plants and high smokestacks. One of the architectural features is that either directly around them or across the street there's a small cemetery. The reason that they have that cemetery is because there was no longer an investment in keeping people alive, because they cost exactly the same amount whether I fed them or not. So I could work them to death, bury them at lunch, and have people come back to work. And if you notice, after that time, in the order of church, order of services for the African Methodist Episcopal Church, Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, AME Zion Church, and a few others, they have a short form funeral. It's designed to be able to put somebody in the ground during the time that you had the 13 minutes that you were allowed to be off for work so that you could get back to that uncompensated labor that you were providing, $5 a day. And the sheriffs also made money from it. And so that was the beginning of the prison industrial complex. What has happened over time is because since 1867, 35 to 80% of all able-bodied, working-age men, black and brown-bodied men in the United States have been under the control of the penal system. Now it's aftermath, it's artwork. Nobody notices that the exact same thing is happening today, but because it's been artwork, it's been aftermath, it's been built in, we don't even notice it. And in order to make it last, in order to make the system work, we tell all kinds of stories about it. We say that they were brutes, that they were either they were lazy or they were aggressive. Either that they were, brutish or they knew too much, they were smart, or they were unteachable. Anyway, the stories don't have to make sense. You just make up a bunch of stories to associate and explain the structures, and then those structures continue. That's how it gets passed down. And then we just learn to behave that way. And so people stop asking questions about it, and we just learn to perform that way. We just act. So what has happened over the generations is that people who never were exposed to traumagenic circumstances learn the performance of trauma. So they act out and they enact the trauma. They enact the performative of trauma without actually having the psychological, physiological experience of it, which means for the most part, in many circumstances, in multi-generational traumatic circumstances, psychosocial approaches and mental health aspects don't reach them because it has nothing, absolutely nothing to do with their mental frame. It has to do with their identity and the performance that they learned growing up. Let me see if I can move this along. Move this along. One other way, if you get a chance, read Jeffrey Alexander's Trauma, a Social Theory. The short form of it is Jeffrey Alexander points out that for many of us, the way that trauma emerges as a collective is this. Traumas emerge at the level of collectivity. For trauma to emerge at the level of collectivity, social crisis has to become cultural crisis. Events are one thing, Alexander says. Representations of these events are quite another. Trauma is not the result of group experiencing pain. It is the result of acute discomfort entering the core of the collective sense of its own identity. Collective actors decide to represent social pain as fundamental threat to their sense of who they are, where they come from, and where they want to go. In the United States, not everybody was directly impacted by the plane crashes in Pennsylvania, New York, and Washington, D.C. Not everybody had friends or relatives. And so for many people, the vision of it, the sight of it, the experience of it, the narrative of it wasn't necessarily overwhelming. What became overwhelming was the notion that we are under threat. And so when our identities, our very existence is under threat, we adopt that as a crisis kind of thing, and it impacts us, so we become overwhelmed. I'm actually glad that the Methodists believe in redemption and grace, because I was in seminary and we were having a speak out. We were talking about sharing our pain and stuff like this. And I said that maybe we should hang one of those construction signs at the Pentagon that says, "Pardon our mess, your tax dollars at work." That wasn't necessarily a narrative that people appreciated in the moment. It wasn't a reframing that people were willing to accept. Okay, I need to introduce one other concept really quickly, and then this framing. So maybe I'll skip all of that and just go straight to the framing. If you get a chance, Miranda Fricker has written a really, well, her work has been adopted and used and expanded. She wrote it a while ago. A notion of epistemic injustice, right? I need you to, I'm skipping a little bit, but epistemic injustice, the idea that people, because of some aspect of their identity, have a credibility deficiency. You can't actually contribute. What you offer into the world is different. The knowledge that you bring is diminished by virtue of certain parts of your identity. And that becomes hermeneutic injustice when it happens for a collective over a long period, and where they not only can't contribute to the immediate knowing, but they can't even know of themselves. Like, their ways of knowing are diminished, discouraged. One of the examples, Tamara, that I got about this here was the fact that I'm certain that Sand Creek, the indigenous people of Sand Creek, have been telling the story of the massacre and the slaughter for a century and a half, but it was only when a certain blue ribbon group of a certain kind of people were qualified to listen and hear the story that it actually had any validation. That's epistemic injustice. That's actually hermeneutic injustice, because all the other ways that they would tell the story are diminished, and so it's unaccessible to them and to others. So anyway, this is what we've got. Ecological problematic with, or ecological rupture, cultural direct violence, cultural violence, structural violence. How do we begin to even build or pretend to build something inside of that? What would be a framing? And so this is the framing that I want to offer. I've skipped a lot, but I'm trying to get us out of here tonight. This is the framing that I want to offer. And I'm glad to talk a little bit more with you about this, or to give you a fuller description of it. So here we go. Peacebuilding, this is our frame. My intention is to do a couple of things. It's to consider all the sources of the rupture. It's to propose a vision at the end of our work, like a shared vision at the end of our work, but also to kind of foreshadow some processes that we might adopt in our approach. So peacebuilding collectively has to be relationally constructed. We're seeking, our aim is to establish identities, performative identities that are relationally constructed, authentic, dignified, interconnected and intersectional, legitimated, and performatively co-equal. So they're relationally constructed in the sense that the individual is not the primary unit of our analysis. Our unit of analysis begins if we follow Bronfenbrenner's understanding, if we follow Foucault's understanding, if we follow all the constructionists. It's relationally constructed. We are given by our relationships, which is why a child without connection around it failure to thrive. Without having direct connection, they will failure to thrive because they need relationality in order to understand themselves. And so it has to be relationally constructed. The authentic nature is that it's from a healed place, a dignified place, a decolonized, unengendered, uncommodified, healed even at the cellular and spiritual level, a healed full self-expression of the individual and the group. The challenge to this is going to be some of the knowledge that we need in order to do this has been hidden from us through this problem of epistemic and hermeneutic injustice. So the work is going to require what Foucault would say is the unveiling of previously subjugated knowledges. Like, how do we go back and give permission to other forms of knowledge, other ways of knowing, to allow us to come into a full and authentic expression of the group and the self. Then it has to be dignified in the sense that the way, not just relationally constructed, but in our relationship with one another, there has to be sufficient space for us to have full self-expression. I don't know if you've all noticed this, but sometimes when we're having these dialogues, reconciliation dialogues, and things like that, some people aren't allowed to show up fully in themselves. It's like, look, if we're going to have dialogue, you need to speak nicely in quiet and indoor tones. You need to use your indoor voice and use the kind words that children can hear in order for us to be effectively in dialogue. The things that you are saying create a space in which I don't feel safe. And so all of that, you know, the fragility, the safety, all of that management doesn't allow for the full self-expression, the full group expression. And so what it's not doing is allowing for a dignified representation of my full authentic self. In order to be in relationship with you, have to be in a compromised position, and it would be better for me to not be related, other than to be in a space where my full expression could be dignified. Relationally constructed, authentic, dignified, interconnected, and intersectional. And this is huge because it's the intersectionality that destroys the binary. If we recognize that it's not this or that, if we recognize that it's not either and or, and allow ourselves to be interconnected, not just amongst ourselves connected, but allow all of the various identities that we bring to be interconnected. It defeats the binaries. You're no longer necessarily owner or worker. You're no longer necessarily teacher or student. You're no longer patient or clinician. You're no longer black or brown or white. You're not gay or straight. You're on a spectrum. And so how do you operate inside of that? Because it's inside of that we're opening up the space for greater and deeper connection, and we find out that we are not distinct. We defeat the foundational notion of the binary. Legitimated, this is speaking to the policies, the laws. There are a lot of laws that are set up. There are a lot of things that are still in the books and in place, policies, procedures that don't allow for the full self-expression and don't allow us to be fully self-expressed and interconnected. We create ways of dividing. We create ways of separating, and we make it just the law so that it doesn't have to be something that we take responsibility for. And then eventually you have to be performatively co-equal, which means that what comes out of it, the way that we show up in the world, has to also be able to be measured at a level of equity, not equality. Equity, right? Huge distinction. And so we're working at that level of performative co-equality, but that's really pushing towards the justice measure of equity. And all of this, I should say, is moving us towards what some are describing as our evolution towards what they're calling, what some people are describing as humanity 3.0. Humanity 1.0 is where we cared for the earth and everything that provides for production, reproduction, and shelter. So it's kind of a tribal and clannish way of being, but there was a tremendous appreciation for feminine energy, including the feminine divine. We were earthbound, but we were kind of set apart. There was a certain isolation at humanity 1.0. Humanity 2.0, the overlap, we have been focusing on extraction, expanding tools for extraction and resource development, We favor ownership, we privilege property rights, we have a patro-hierarchical diminishment of the tribe, of the clan, of those that operate in 1.0. It's a power over system where we extract and we commodify, and we've operated for long enough time in this binary. And the work that we have to do, the work that we're moving to, is relational, network, dispersed, leadership, asset-based. It's that quantum work where we're operating spectral, related, and relative. If we can coordinate our various disciplines in ways that allow us to all have the same aim, so even if you're doing your own individual work, if we all have the same aim, which is to produce identities that are relationally constructed, authentic, dignified, interconnected, legitimated, and performatively co-equal, then we are narrating our way, we are changing the narrative, we are changing the discourse, and we're moving our way towards humanity 3.0. And I would suggest to you that that's our work. Thank you.
Thank you so much for speaking to us. Can you get a little bit into detail about equality versus equity? I know that's a whole nother talk, but could you give us a few examples of what you mean by that?
Yes. So the easiest example is in a healthcare setting. It's equal. Everybody has access to primary health care. And it's also equal because nobody has access to dental care unless you can pay for it. And so while in its structural manifestation, there is an equality, but the capacities that everybody has to experience the benefits of what's actually out and available is not equal, it's not equitable. Right? And so the equity, the other simple example, a really simple example is equity, everybody gets shoes. Equality, everybody gets shoes, right? As you're moving closer to equity, everybody gets shoes that fit. If you really want full equity and transformation, you got to give everybody shoes that fit for the thing that they want to do. And so if everybody has shoes that fit, some people need hiking shoes, and some people need sneakers, and some people need dress shoes. You get what you need and not equally distributing across all. And so it requires kind of fundamentally equal access to the resources and opportunities that everybody needs to thrive and survive and make full contribution from their context. That's the short version. Yeah.
Thank you for your incredible talk. And I want to focus on, am I on? Is it on? Okay. Your definition of peacebuilding, which is an interwoven set of practices that share the aim of establishing identities that are relationally constructed, authentic, dignified, interconnected, and intersectional, legitimated, and performatively co-equal.
Yes.
So you are focusing on the core task of peacebuilding being around identity construction and nurturing. At least that's my interpretation of that. Can you talk more about what you consider to be that interwoven set of practices that reinforces those kinds of identities?
So the interwoven set of practices, there's a whole piece that I dropped out, but the interwoven set of practices this allows for the fact that people operate at different levels. And so psychosocial work, the clinical and individual work, the relational work, the asset building, the agricultural work, all of those kinds of things, plus the people who are working on, education is a 20-year project to see, to change education, to change values, to change values is a 50 to 100-year project. And so the people who are doing art and theater and music and the things that last and transcend cross-generationally are also doing the work. And so what happens is we have to find ways to interweave all of those works, and this is moving away from the silos, and this is not necessarily prescribing particular practices. It's the interwoven set of practices really that allow for kind of the cultural contextualization of the work, because certain practices, certain ideas work much better in certain situations, and you're working across all the levels of organizational strategy and across the dimensions of time in the work. And so it's an interwoven set of practices. And the weaving is because the silo thing, which is where people are most comfortable, is problematic in a lot of ways, right? And so one of the things that I think STAR has done very well is to begin Strategies for Trauma Awareness and Resilience, a program that came out of Eastern Mennonite University in the aftermath of 9/11. One of the things they did really well was they identify these 5 portals: trauma healing, restorative justice, conflict transformation, spirituality, and security. Thank you. And so all of those are very different, but they're pointing towards a process of a healed community. So you have the notion of community healed in the middle, and all of them are pointing towards that. And at some point, you have to understand how trauma informs restorative justice, how conflict transformation reframes trauma work, how spirituality, not religion, but all the transcendent practices, art and theater and music and breathing and nature, and how all of those things inform the process. And you can never get there having done one set. So if you come in and you do your work and you leave, you've probably done more of a disservice than not. And if you're doing reconciliation work and dialogue work outside of the context of a holistic process, it's probably creating more problematic than it's contributing to the end result. And so it's the interweaving that matters, right? We have to, beyond partner is often like we're partnering, like we're operating the same funding pool, we share schedules, we share conference rooms, we share training spaces, and that kind of thing. That's partnering. I don't think that's interweaving, because at some point we have to also be willing to have our ideas and our foundational practices challenged, changed, reconsidered, reconstructed. Then we're interweaving. We're not partnering. Partnering is just like the latest thing that we do so that the funders will send us both a check because they're not willing to send one or the other, right?
I like this dialogue of interweaving, and it reminded me a lot of Vandana Shiva and how she writes about monocultures. And specifically, she talks about what is missed and what goes missing when we choose to monoculture. And from your language, it exists in the silo. And she takes that sort of frame and applies it to our social world as well. So she moves from a space of agriculture and the importance of biodiversity, right? I guess the question that I want to ask you is, where is there a place in Humanity 3.0? Has your work ever come across sort of ecological theories? And are there connections that you've made or that exist?
So this is the thing. This is one of the places where I would, in a different space, I would kind of shift into a different model of talking about this, because Humanity 3.0 is the already and the not yet. Like, it is already emerging. There are a number of places where you can begin to see it. It just hasn't become the dominant narrative, right? It is in place. People are operating. When you see science, the metaphors of science shifting from particle to the interconnected probability, the quantum nature. When science is shifting, theology is shifting slower. It's a slower boat. Educational practices are shifting into that relational, so you're starting to see it, and it's merging. It just hasn't become the dominant narrative. In the same way that there are still some Humanity 1.0 places, Humanity 2.0 seems to be the dominant narrative, and our work, and I should say this, is to help to structure a narrative for a preferred future. Where we get caught up is that we try to have consensus about what the shared future should be. And so consensus becomes a blockage to building shared futures. My colleague at Stanford, Byron Bland, helps with this because he says most of the time we're trying to build a shared narrative of the future, which is we all have to agree on where we're going, and we won't even start until we've agreed on where we're going. He says a shared narrative of the future is disruptive. What we need is a narrative of a shared future. One that says that what I'm up to doesn't threaten what you're up to. What I'm up to may at some point allow for us to coexist, cooperate, but it doesn't in any way diminish your possibilities, because it's in the narrative of a shared future where things like trust may actually emerge, where things like reconciliation become more possible, but they only become possible when we actually see that we both can go on together without necessarily diminishing either of our possibilities. Right now in the world, there's at least not, well, in some parts of the world, in pockets of the world, certainly in these aspiring but yet to be United States, there's this real tension going on. There's all this stuff, we call it racism and, heterosexism and all these other things that are rising up. And some of that is because of a threat to identities. David Rock, do you guys know David Rock's work? David Rock, he has this acronym of SCARF, S-C-A-R-F, SCARF. Status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. He's a neuropsychologist at Harvard. And the research suggests that a loss of status, a diminishment of status, triggers the same neural pathways as if somebody had a gun to your head or a knife to your throat. It's the same level of fear. And so for so many people in these, from time to time, United States, there was a property value of whiteness that was preserved and protected so that no matter how poor you were, no matter how abject your circumstances were, you could always say, at least I'm not black. And with the elevation of all these folks who now look a lot different, there's a browning in the world, and so there's an actual status threat which causes a reaction that looks very much like the fight, flight, trauma reaction, and we're in the midst of it. We're also in the midst of a dying order because, a bee stings at the end of the summer right before it knows it's going to die. And a wounded animal is its most vicious because it knows that its demise is approximating. Even if you look in the air, a supernova, when we see it, it's at its brightest, it's flaring out, but by the time we see it, it has already actually burnt out. If you know anything about time, you know that when you're looking at it, most of the stars, half the stars that are up there are stuff that's burnt out. It's just reported to us late. A supernova is really bright. By the time we see it, it's already burnt out. And so what we're watching is an era that has already actually died. Humanity 3.0 is already and not yet, I promise you, and our work is just to usher it in and to provide a narrative that allows it to come in a little less violently than it's currently coming. And if I had an organ, Dave, I would take that someplace.
Yeah. Thank you very much. That's very enlightening. My comment or question, I don't know where it leads, but in the course of Peacebuilding, dealing with actors that does not have the same level of powers, how do you try to bridge and where will be the shared, common, whatever future narrative as you refer to, and what is needed to be done to be able to reach these common agreed upon future narrative. I'm talking, and if you have practical experiences from either political or social kind of rupture situation, that would be nice.
Okay.
Thank you.
So the work that we're in, the relationships are the mechanism through which power is distributed. Part of the shift in power goes from the isolated to the connected. Part of the way that you build and exercise power is through connectedness. And so a lot of our work is in organizing. You work at the middle levels and the grassroots level to have enough people expressing and operating inside of a different narrative. People actually choose to not relate to certain systems anymore, which changes the power associated with those systems. Sometimes it's that stringent kind of thing that we would call like a protest or a boycott, and people say we're just not going to deal with those systems because the power, so we've got enough of us to do that, to change the systems. Other times it's less, it's other kind of resistance. And so like I work with a lot of young men, a lot of young black and brown bodied men that have resisted a school system that completely denigrates their existence. They call them dropouts. We know they're resistors, right? And so we are organizing a resistance movement that makes it okay to not be in that system. And by virtue of withdrawing your participation, it demonstrates, it shows the fallacy and the problematic that the system is operating in, and they actually are required for a variety of reasons to begin to shift. And so why do people negotiate? People only negotiate when they believe they can do better with you than without you. And so you create the circumstance in which they recognize that your contribution is valuable. Sometimes that's in continuing to relate. Sometimes it's in withdrawing your relational pattern and practice and doing something else, operating in a new and different and preferred narrative, which is what we're trying to do in Greensboro. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in our panel tomorrow morning, so, or tomorrow afternoon, whenever you and I are talking. So, yeah. Is that it? That should be it. No more questions. Perfect. Okay. That's enough. Thank you.